Have you ever felt watched in an empty building or sensed something hunting you in the woods? Welcome to Unspoken Fears. Tonight, we're diving into 10 disturbing encounters from Pennsylvania's most isolated small towns, places where help is miles away and something unnatural lurks in the shadows. These accounts come from real people who survived experiences they still can't explain. Names and identifying details have been altered for privacy, but these stories are real. Drop your location and the time you're watching in the comments below. If these tales unsettle you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true horror. Let's begin. My name is Abel, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 5 years, I've worked as a maintenance technician for a property management company that handles abandoned industrial sites across northwestern Pennsylvania. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent, and most nights are quiet. I do security checks, basic repairs, make sure squatters haven't moved in, and that the buildings aren't actively falling apart. October 2019 was when I took an overnight shift at the old Brookside textile mill in Bradford, and what happened that night made me quit a job I actually liked. I'm telling you this because I need someone to know, and because if you ever find yourself working security in an abandoned factory, you need to understand that some places never really stop running. The Brookside Mill shut down in 1987 when the company went bankrupt. It's a massive 4-story brick structure on the east side of Bradford, most of the windows broken out, rust bleeding down the walls like the building itself is slowly dying. When these old mills closed, they usually just walked away from everything. The machinery, the furniture, the files, all of it left exactly where it was. My company got hired to maintain it because some developer thought they might convert it to apartments someday, though I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to live there. The place felt wrong, even in daylight. I started my shift at midnight on October 18th. The dispatcher, a guy I'd worked with before, called to confirm I was on site. "You're at Brookside tonight, Abel. Just do your rounds every 2 hours, check for water leaks on the 4th floor where the roof's bad, and call if you see anything unusual." I told him I would, grabbed my flashlight and clipboard, and headed into the building. The front entrance was accessible, but I had to prop the door because the lock mechanism was broken. Cold October air followed me inside, and I could taste metal on my tongue immediately. That particular flavor you get in old industrial buildings where machines leaked oil and chemicals for decades. The first floor was what you'd expect. Empty receiving area, some rusted equipment, pigeon droppings everywhere, and that smell of mildew and decay that seeps into everything. My footsteps echoed on the concrete, and wind whistled through the broken windows. I did my initial walkthrough, noted some new graffiti in the stairwell, and settled into the small office area we used as a base. I had a thermos of coffee, my phone for entertainment, and 8 hours to kill. At 2 in the morning, I heard the first sound that shouldn't have been there. It was rhythmic thumping from somewhere above me, exactly like running looms. I'd worked in an active textile plant briefly in my 20s, and I knew that sound. The mechanical rhythm of fabric being woven, the thump, thump, thump of the shuttle moving back and forth. But that was impossible. This building had been dead for 32 years. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the stairs, my boots crunching on broken glass. The sound was coming from the 3rd floor, getting louder as I climbed. My heart was pounding, and I kept telling myself it was pipes, or the building settling, or wind moving something. Anything but what it sounded like. When I pushed open the 3rd floor door, the thumping stopped. Just like that, instant silence except for my own breathing. I swept my flashlight across the vast open floor, and the beam caught hundreds of silent looms arranged in rows, covered in decades of dust. The air smelled wrong up there, though. Not the usual mustiness, but something sharp and chemical, like ozone, like electrical equipment that's been running hot. I walked between the machines, my light finding disturbed dust patterns around them, even though they were motionless. The temperature felt different too, warmer than it should be for an unheated building in October. I called out, "Hello? Anyone up here?" My voice sounded small in that massive space, and no one answered. I was about to leave when my flashlight beam caught something that made me stop cold. In the far corner of the floor, there was an electrical panel that was lit up, green LEDs glowing in the darkness. That couldn't be right. This building had been disconnected from the power grid in 1988. I walked over slowly, my mouth dry and tasting like copper. The panel was active, displaying readouts I didn't understand. Next to it, I found a section of the floor I'd never seen before on previous checks. There were computers there, old ones. Those boxy monitors with green screens like you'd see in the 80s. And they were on, running, displaying production schedules with dates, shift times, and employee names I didn't recognize. I pulled out my phone to call my supervisor, Patrick, but I had no signal. Up on the third floor, I should have had at least one bar, but the screen showed nothing. I looked back at the computer screens, and my stomach dropped. The production schedule showed October 18th, 2019, today's date, current time, and a list of names that meant nothing to me, organized by station numbers. I touched one of the keyboards, and it was warm. I could feel vibrations through the desk, like the computers were connected to something running. The smell of heated plastic and electronics filled my nose, and I realized I could hear something now, a low electrical hum coming from deeper in the floor. That's when all the machinery started up at once. Every loom on the third floor roared to life, and I screamed. The sound was deafening, the mechanical thunder of dozens of industrial looms operating simultaneously, shuttles flying, spools spinning, and I could see fabric appearing on them, materializing like it was being woven from nothing. The floor shook under my feet from the vibrations. Between the machines, I saw them. Silhouettes of people moving in the aisles, walking between looms, reaching up to adjust settings, their movements precise and purposeful. They didn't acknowledge me at all. They just worked. These shadow people operating ghost machines that were somehow running without any power source. I shouted at them, "Hey, who are you? What's going on?" But my voice was swallowed by the mechanical noise. The air tasted like chemicals now, like industrial dyes and human sweat, and the heat was intense, radiating from the machines like they'd been running for hours. I could smell hot metal and burning cloth. A dot matrix printer suddenly chattered to life next to me, and I watched it print out a production report. With shaking hands, I grabbed the paper. It was still warm from the printer. The header read, "Brookside Textile Mill, third shift production report, October 18th, 2019. I scanned down the list of worker names, and at the bottom, in a section labeled Terminated, I found my own name. Abel. Status, terminated. Date, 10/18/2019. I ran for the stairwell door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't open. I pulled and pushed, and it wouldn't budge, like it was welded shut from the other side. I spun around, and in the glow of the machines and the green computer screens, I saw my reflection in a dark window. But it wasn't just my reflection. There was a silhouette of me standing at one of the looms, operating it, my shadow self working a machine I wasn't touching. I could see my own face in that window, standing by the door, but I could also see myself working in the rows of machinery. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, and in its spinning beam I saw more impossible things. My silhouette was appearing at multiple machines now, multiplying, joining the workforce of shadows. I could hear my own voice saying words I wasn't speaking, overlapping with the machinery noise, calling out production numbers and shift updates. I felt invisible hands trying to guide me toward the looms, a gentle pressure on my shoulders, turning me toward an empty station. The air was so hot now that I was sweating, and I could taste metal and chemicals coating the inside of my mouth. The computer screens were all displaying my name now, station assignments, production quotas. The machines seemed to roar louder, and I realized they wanted me. They wanted me to take my station, to join the third shift that never ended. I made a decision born of pure panic. There was a window about 20 feet away. and below it was the second-floor roof section. I ran for it, my boots pounding on the floor that was shaking from the machines. Behind me, I heard the sound change, the looms operating faster, more urgently, like they knew I was trying to escape. I grabbed a piece of broken equipment and smashed out what was left of the window glass. Cold October air rushed in, and I've never been so grateful for anything in my life. I climbed through, hung from the sill, and dropped down to the second-floor roof. I hit hard, rolled, and scrambled to the edge. It was a 15-foot drop to the ground, but I didn't care. I jumped, landed in overgrown grass, and ran to my truck without looking back. The next morning, I met Patrick at a diner in town. He wasn't happy. "You abandoned your post, Abel. You broke a window. What the hell happened?" I tried to explain, my coffee shaking in my hands as I told him about the machines, the computers, the shadows, my name on the termination list. He listened with increasing skepticism, his face showing exactly what he thought of my story. "Abel, you've been working too many night shifts. There's no power in that building. You probably fell asleep and had a nightmare." But I insisted we go back, that I'd show him. He agreed, probably just to prove me wrong. We went back that morning, sunshine making the building look almost normal. We climbed to the third floor and I felt sick. Everything was cold and silent. The machines were covered in undisturbed dust, thick layers of it that clearly hadn't been touched in years. There was no electrical panel with green lights, no computers, just empty desk spaces with nothing on them. The air smelled only of mildew and decay, that normal abandoned building smell. Patrick walked around, showing me the dust, the cobwebs, the obvious abandonment. "See? Nothing's been running here for decades. Maybe you saw some homeless person and panicked." I couldn't explain the broken window I'd used to escape. I'd smashed it from the inside. That much was clear. Patrick sighed. "Look, just take a few days off. You're stressed." I couldn't let it go. I went to a local diner that afternoon and found an old-timer who'd worked at Brookside back in the day. His name was Griffin, and he was in his 70s. And when I mentioned the mill, his face changed. "You worked there at night?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He stirred his coffee for a long moment. "In 1986, there was an electrical fire on the third floor. Night shift, October 15th. 23 workers died. They were trapped because the stairwell doors had been chained shut from the outside, some kind of illegal safety violation to prevent theft. The mill closed the next year, officially because of bankruptcy, but really because of the lawsuits." He looked at me directly. "Those workers never met their production quota that night. The fire happened at 2 in the morning. Maybe they're still trying to finish their shift." I quit that afternoon. I told Patrick I was done, couldn't give him a reason he'd accept, and I walked away from a decent job. But sometimes I drive past the Brookside Mill, usually late at night when I can't sleep. On certain nights, I see a green glow in the third-floor windows. I park and watch, and I can see movement up there, shadows passing back and forth between the machines. The building is still abandoned, still officially powerless, but that third shift is still running. They're still trying to meet their quota, still working 33 years after they died. And they wanted me to join them. That's why my name was on the termination list. Not fired. Terminated. Ended. They were going to add me to their crew, make me part of the endless shift. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. Some places don't let go of their workers. Some places keep running long after they should have stopped, and they need people to maintain that operation. If you ever take a security job in an abandoned factory and you hear machinery that shouldn't be running, don't investigate. Don't try to understand it. Just leave. Because once they add your name to their roster, once they assign you a station, you might not get another chance to escape. I got out because I was willing to jump through a window and break my ankle. Not everyone will be that lucky. The third shift at Brookside is still hiring, still running, still waiting for anyone foolish enough to stay past closing time. Don't be the one who clocks in and never clocks out. My name is Scarlett, and I'm 27 years old. Back in June of 2003, I was driving a school bus in Lancaster County, living just outside Intercourse in Pennsylvania Dutch country. If you don't know the area, it's Amish farmland, rolling hills covered in corn and tobacco, horse-drawn buggies sharing the roads with cars, and hex signs painted on every barn. Those colorful circular designs aren't just decoration. They're supposed to bring protection, good harvests, healthy livestock. The Amish and Mennonite folks take them seriously, even if most English people like me just think they're pretty. What happened that summer taught me those symbols mean something real, and painting the wrong one can open doors that should stay closed forever. I wasn't Amish, but I'd lived in the area my whole life. My bus route took me past dozens of farms every day, and I knew most of the families by sight, if not by name. The Amish keep to themselves mostly, but they're good neighbors. They'd wave when I drove past, sell me fresh vegetables at their roadside stands, and we had that comfortable distance that comes from respecting each other's ways. One family I saw every morning had a farm right on my route, a beautiful property with a big red barn that had traditional hex signs painted on it. Bright primary colors, stars, and flowers, the kind you see on tourist postcards. The father was an older man, white beard down to his chest, always working in the fields with his sons. His wife ran a produce stand at the end of their driveway, and I'd stop there sometimes for tomatoes or sweet corn. In early June, I noticed something different. There was a man I'd never seen before at the farm, up on a ladder against the barn, painting. Not one of the family, but an outsider. Also plain dressed, but something about him felt off. The Amish have a certain way about them, a calm steadiness. But this man moved with nervous energy, and even from the road I could see the design he was painting looked wrong. Hex signs follow specific patterns, traditional designs passed down for generations. This one had 8 points instead of the usual 6. And spirals that seemed to twist in ways that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. The colors were right, the traditional reds and blues and yellows, but the geometry was all wrong. It made me feel dizzy just glancing at it as I drove past. Over the next few days, I noticed changes at that farm. The children, who usually played in the yard before school, were staying inside. The horses in the pasture nearest the barn were pressed against the far fence, as far from the building as they could get. When I stopped at the produce stand, the wife looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, and she barely spoke. Normally, she'd chat about the weather or ask about my family, but that morning, she just took my money for the corn and turned away. The air around the property smelled wrong, too. A rotting smell that didn't match the fresh hay I could see baled in the field. It was subtle, but definitely there, like something dead hidden in the barn. A week after the hex sign was finished, I saw the ambulance. I was driving my afternoon route when I passed the farm and saw emergency vehicles in the driveway, lights flashing. The next day, at the produce stand, a teenage girl was working instead of the mother. Her name was Aurora, and she was the oldest daughter, maybe 16. I asked if everything was okay, and she looked at me with frightened eyes. "My grandfather collapsed in the barn," she said quietly. "He's alive, but he won't wake up properly. He speaks in tongues we don't know." Her English was good but formal, the way Amish kids speak when they've learned it in school but don't use it much. "The man who painted the sign, he won't come back. He says he made a mistake, but he won't fix it." She looked toward the barn, and I followed her gaze to that wrong hex sign. Even in afternoon sunlight, it seemed to shimmer, the spirals appearing to rotate if you didn't look directly at them. I'm not superstitious normally, but something about the whole situation bothered me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Aurora's scared face, about the horses refusing to go near the barn, about that smell. Around midnight, I got in my car and drove past the farm, telling myself I was just checking, though I'm not sure what I thought I could do. What I saw made me pull over and cut my engine. Every buggy and wagon from nearby Amish farms was parked around the property. Lantern light glowed inside the barn, and I could see dozens of people gathered there, the entire community. They were trying to paint over the hex sign, but even from the road I could see it wasn't working. The paint wouldn't stick. It slid off the design like oil on water, dripping down the barn wall in streams. I got out of my car, drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine concern. The smell hit me immediately, so much stronger than before. Sulfur and burning, but nothing was on fire. The air tasted bitter on my tongue, like I'd bitten into something rotten. I walked closer, staying in the shadows, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave. The Amish community was praying in German, their voices rising and falling in harmony, and several men were trying to paint over the hex sign with white paint. But I watched the paint bubble and run off, steaming like it had been applied to a hot surface. The barn wall wasn't hot, though. When one man touched it testing, he jerked his hand back and I heard him cry out. The wood was ice cold, he said in English, cold enough to burn skin. That's when I saw it start to happen. The center of the hex sign began to distort, the spirals moving for real now, not just an optical illusion. Reality itself seemed to shimmer around it, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was different. This was space-bending, folding in ways that made my brain hurt to perceive. The air around the symbol took on colors I don't have names for, shades that don't exist in normal light. I could hear a sound building, low and resonant, like fabric tearing but massive, the sound of something ripping through from somewhere else. Several Amish women fell to their knees, hands over their ears, and I realized I was tasting blood from where I'd bitten my cheek without noticing. Through that distortion, through that impossible fold in space at the center of the hex sign, something was pushing through. I couldn't see it clearly, couldn't focus my eyes on it, but I knew it was there. Shapes that might have been limbs or wings or concepts I had no framework to understand. The geometry was all wrong, angles that shouldn't connect but did, curves that hurt to look at. The sound grew louder, multiple voices harmonizing in that unknown language Aurora's grandfather had been speaking. The Amish community was backing away now, still praying, but with panic in their voices. One of the bishops, an elderly man with authority in his bearing, shouted something in German, and several young men ran for the barn with torches. The fire started at the edges, but it didn't spread normally. It moved in a spiral pattern, following the design of the hex sign, burning inward in a perfect geometric curve. The flames were the wrong color, too bright, almost white, and they made no smoke. I could feel the heat from where I stood 50 feet away, intense and immediate, but the fire moved with purpose, like it was being directed. The thing coming through the hex sign pulled back, or was pushed back, I couldn't tell which. The tearing sound became a shriek, something between animal pain and machinery breaking, and then the entire barn was engulfed in that spiral of white fire. The heat was incredible, and I could smell burning wood and something else, something chemical and ancient like burning minerals from deep in the earth. By dawn, the barn was gone. Just ash and the foundation stones remained, but burned into the ground where the barn had stood was the pattern. The hex sign design was scorched into the earth itself, the spiral and 8-pointed star visible as blackened soil that would grow nothing. I learned later that Aurora's grandfather died during the fire. His last words were in that unknown language, syllables that the family's bishop said sounded older than German, older than any language he'd ever heard. The family held a quiet funeral, and within 2 months, they'd moved away. An Amish family from Ohio bought the land and built a new barn, but they built it 20 feet away from that burned spot, and they put no hex signs on it at all. I kept driving that route for another year before I moved to a different county. Every time I passed that farm, I'd look at the spot where the barn had been. Nothing would grow in that spiral pattern. No grass, no weeds, nothing. The new family plowed it under and planted over it, but the crops died in that exact shape, leaving the design visible in dead plants against living ones. On overcast days, if the light was right, you could still see the faint outline of the hex sign, like it had been branded into reality itself. Sometimes I'd see the new family's children playing in the yard, but they never went near that spot. Even the animals wouldn't cross it. I've thought a lot about what happened. The Pennsylvania Dutch have been painting hex signs for hundreds of years, following traditional patterns passed down through generations. Those patterns are safe, proven, protective. But that painter, that broker, he deviated from tradition. He'd created something new, something that connected to places we shouldn't be connected to. The Amish community learned a hard lesson that summer about why some traditions exist. Not everything old is just superstition. Some symbols are warnings. Some designs are locks on doors that must stay closed. And some things waiting on the other side are hungry for any opening we give them. What do you think was coming through that hex sign? Have you ever seen traditional symbols or designs that felt wrong in ways you couldn't explain? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If you found this account disturbing, hit that like button and subscribe to Unspoken Fears for more real experiences from people who've encountered the unexplainable. My name is Jennifer. I'm 29 years old, and in February of 2017, I was working as a certified nursing assistant at Pine Grove Care Center in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. It's a small facility, just 32 beds, mostly elderly residents with dementia or long-term care needs. I'd been there for 3 years, working the evening shift from 3 in the afternoon until 11 at night. I genuinely loved my job. These residents weren't just patients to me. They were people with stories, with families, with dignity that deserved respect, even when their minds or bodies were failing them. What happened over the course of one shift in February destroyed that facility and changed how I see the human body. I'm sharing this because someone needs to document what occurred, even if most people won't believe it. February 14th was a Tuesday, Valentine's Day, though that didn't mean much in a nursing home beyond some decorations the day shift had put up. I came in for report at 3, and the day shift CNA handed off her assignments. Everything seemed normal. Vital signs were stable, medications had been given. 2 residents needed to be changed soon, the usual routine. I made my rounds, checking on everyone, chatting with those who were alert enough to talk. Around 5 in the evening, while I was helping residents into the dining room for dinner, one of them stopped me. His name was Raphael, 81 years old, former coal miner, still sharp mentally despite his body being worn out from decades of hard labor underground. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and said something I'll never forget. "Jennifer, my skin doesn't fit right anymore." I looked at him, expecting maybe a rash or dry skin, common complaints in elderly patients. But when I examined his arm, I saw what he meant. His skin looked looser, somehow, like it was separating from the tissue beneath it. The texture was different too, slightly waxy, and when I touched it to assess, it felt wrong. Too cool, too slippery, like touching a candle that had started to melt. I told him I'd keep an eye on it and let the nurse know. 20 minutes later, 3 more residents flagged me down with the same complaint. Their skin didn't fit. It felt loose, strange, like they were wearing someone else's body. By 7 in the evening, 12 residents were reporting the same sensation. The charge nurse, a woman named Violet, who'd been at Pine Grove for 15 years, was getting worried. She called the on-call doctor, described the symptoms, and he suggested it might be a reaction to the new laundry detergent the facility had started using. He said to monitor the residents and call back if it got worse. It got worse. By 8 o'clock, the skin on the affected residents wasn't just loose anymore. It was beginning to slough off, not bleeding, not like a burn or injury, but peeling away in sheets like the worst sunburn you've ever seen. Except underneath there was no raw flesh. There was something else entirely. The first time I saw what was beneath the skin, I thought I was hallucinating from stress. Raphael called for help, and when I came into his room, his forearm skin had peeled back completely. Underneath, instead of muscle and tissue, There was a crystalline structure, geometric patterns, iridescent surfaces that caught the fluorescent light and split it into colors. It looked like quartz or some kind of mineral formation, but it was growing where his flesh should have been. The structures were angular, precise, repeating patterns that formed the rough shape of an arm, but made of something that definitely wasn't human tissue. I stood there with my mouth open, unable to process what I was seeing. Raphael looked at his arm and started crying. "What's happening to me?" I ran to get Violet, and by the time we returned with the medication cart, thinking maybe we could sedate him and figure this out, 6 more residents were in the same condition. Skin peeling away, crystalline structures emerging beneath. The smell in the building had changed too. Before, it was the usual nursing home combination of antiseptic and bodily fluids and cafeteria food. Now there was something else. A chemical sweetness like antifreeze, thick and cloying, making everyone nauseous. The air itself felt different, heavier, almost syrupy. I could taste it on my tongue, and it made me want to gag. Violet called 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher kept asking her to clarify, and how could she? How do you explain that 15 human beings are turning into crystal? The EMTs arrived within 10 minutes, but when they came through the front door and saw the first resident, they stopped. One of them actually backed up toward the exit. The residents who were transforming had started to move differently. Their joints were bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, their bodies reconfiguring into geometric shapes that maintained a roughly human outline but clearly weren't human anymore. The crystalline structures were clicking as they moved, a sound like glass wind chimes or ice shifting. The EMTs refused to come further into the building. They stood in the lobby, radios crackling, arguing with dispatch about what they were seeing. Through the chaos, I heard one of them say biochemical hazard and call the state. I went back to check on Raphael because even if I didn't understand what was happening, these were still my residents, still people who needed care. His transformation was nearly complete. His entire body had become this crystalline structure, geometric and alien, but his face was still partially human. Half flesh, half crystal, and his eyes were aware. He was still in there, still conscious, experiencing whatever this was. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it even though I was terrified. Half of his hand was still warm flesh. The other half was cold geometric solid, hard and sharp-edged. Jennifer, his voice was distorted, coming from a throat that was half human, half something else. Let it finish. Please. Staying between his agony. I didn't know what to say. Tears were running down my face. This man who I'd cared for, who told me stories about mining in the 60s, who loved chocolate pudding and old westerns on television, was being replaced by something inhuman, and he was begging me to let it happen because fighting it was torture. What do you say to that? What do you do? By 9 o'clock, the CDC arrived. Personnel in full hazmat suits, the kind you see in movies about outbreaks. They came through the building like an invasion, setting up equipment, taking samples, corralling all the staff into one room for questioning. The residents who'd fully transformed weren't registering as alive on medical equipment. No heartbeat, no respiration, no brain activity on portable monitors. But they were moving. The crystalline structures were reorganizing themselves, shifting and reconfiguring like they were solving some kind of puzzle. Watching it made me dizzy. The patterns didn't follow any logic my brain could understand. The CDC officers loaded the transformed residents into unmarked vehicles. 15 people who'd been human that morning were now something else, being taken to some facility none of us would ever know about. The rest of the residents, the ones who hadn't transformed, were evacuated to other nursing homes. The staff, all 12 of us who'd been working that shift, were held in quarantine for 72 hours. Medical tests, blood draws, psychological evaluations, and interviews where men in suits asked the same questions over and over. What did we see? When did it start? Did we touch the affected individuals? Had there been any unusual incidents at the facility recently? On the third day, they made us sign papers, non-disclosure agreements with federal penalties attached. They said if we spoke about what happened, we'd be prosecuted. The official story was structural contamination, chemical exposure from old building materials. Pine Grove Care Center was condemned and demolished within 2 months. But before I signed those papers, before they threatened me into silence, I did some research on my phone while I was still in quarantine. I searched for the history of that land, that building. Pine Grove was built in 1982, but before that the site had been something else. Old property records showed a mineral mine operating there from 1955 to 1967. It was sealed after workers reported unusual crystal formations growing in the deepest shafts, formations that seemed to move and reorganize when they weren't being observed. The mine was filled with concrete and sealed, supposedly safe, supposedly contained. But the nursing home was built right over it, and maybe the seal wasn't as good as they thought. Maybe whatever was growing down there found a way up, seeping into the groundwater, into the air, into the bodies of vulnerable, elderly people whose immune systems couldn't fight off something that wasn't a bacteria or virus, but a fundamental restructuring at the cellular level. I still have nightmares about Raphael's face, half human and half geometric crystal, his expression of suffering frozen between two states of being. I check my own skin compulsively now, looking for any sign of that waxy texture, that looseness, that first indication that something's wrong at the cellular level. The facility is gone, but the mine is still under that ground. Whatever caused the transformation is still down there, sealed behind concrete that's now over 50 years old. Seals don't last forever. Concrete cracks, things seep through, and there are old mines all over Pennsylvania, thousands of them, some mapped and some forgotten. How many are sealed? How many have strange mineral formations that workers reported before abandoning the sites? How many are under buildings where people live and work, completely unaware of what's beneath their feet? I left healthcare after Pine Grove. I couldn't go back to patient care knowing that something like this could happen and be covered up, that people could be transformed into something inhuman and disappeared, that the government would rather hide it than warn anyone about the danger. If you're watching this from Pennsylvania, especially if you're in an area with old mining history, I need you to understand that what's underground doesn't always stay underground. The earth has layers of history we don't fully understand, and sometimes human activity breaks seals that should never be broken. Pay attention to changes in your body, unusual sensations, anything that feels fundamentally wrong. And if you start to feel like your skin doesn't fit right anymore, get away from that location immediately. Don't wait. Don't assume it's nothing, because by the time the transformation starts, it might already be too late to stop it. Have you ever lived or worked above old mining sites? Do you know what's actually beneath the ground where you're standing right now? Share your location and any strange experiences you've had in the comments below. Your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late. My name is Brody, and I'm 42 years old. Back in November of 1998, I worked as an engineer at WKRP, a small AM radio station in Kane, Pennsylvania. Kane's a tiny town in McKean County, population maybe 4,000, surrounded by Allegheny National Forest. The station played classic rock on 1340 AM, reaching maybe 30 miles on a clear night. My job was straightforward. Come in at midnight, run the pre-recorded overnight programming, make sure everything stayed on air until the morning guy arrived at 6. The equipment was old even then. Cart machines for commercials, vinyl records, CD players, and an analog mixing board that probably dated back to the 70s. The building itself was even older, a converted house that also held equipment from a defunct FM station that had gone dark back in 1985. That dead station and its abandoned transmitters are what changed everything. November in northwestern Pennsylvania gets cold and dark early. By midnight, Kane basically shuts down. Main Street is empty. Nothing moving except maybe a deer or two wandering through. The station building sat on the edge of town, surrounded by pine trees, and at night, it felt like the last occupied place on Earth. I didn't mind the isolation. Overnight shifts meant decent pay, no management breathing down my neck, and I could read or mess around online between checking the equipment. The internet was still pretty new in 1998. Dial-up connections that took forever to load anything, but it helped pass the time. That night, November 11th, I logged in around 12:30, made myself coffee from the ancient pot we kept in the back room, and settled in for what I thought would be another quiet shift. Around 2:30 in the morning, I started hearing something odd bleeding into our broadcast. A voice, very faint, underneath the music we were playing. I pulled off my headphones and listened to the studio monitors. There it was, a male voice speaking call letters, but not ours. WKNR-FM 94.5, your sound alternative. That station had been dead for 13 years. I checked all our equipment, every connection, every mixer channel. Everything was exactly as it should be. No external feed, no crossed wires, nothing that would explain phantom audio appearing on our signal. But I could still hear it, persistent and growing slightly louder. I grabbed my flashlight and went into the back storage room where we kept the old FM equipment. Nobody had touched that stuff in over a decade. Dusty transmitters, rack-mounted processors, a whole broadcast chain that should have been completely inert. But when I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Electrical burning, ozone, like equipment that had been running hot for hours. Then I saw the glow. Transmitter tubes, big glass vacuum tubes that should have been dark and cold, were lit up orange through their coating of dust. The equipment was on, powered, running. I reached out to touch one of the transmitter housings, and warmth radiated from the metal. This was impossible. The FM station had been physically disconnected from all power sources when it shut down in 1985. I stood there, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe there was some residual power, some capacitor still holding a charge after 13 years. Even as I thought it, I knew how ridiculous that sounded. Then the voice got louder. Coming from an old speaker mounted above the FM equipment, a broadcast was playing. Not just carrier signal, not just noise, but actual programming. A DJ talking about upcoming songs, reading weather forecasts, giving news updates. I recognized the format, remembered it vaguely from when I was younger, and WKNR was still on the air. But the dates he was mentioning were wrong. November 11th, 1985. 13 years ago exactly. I pulled out my phone to call Riley, the station owner, but got no signal. That was odd because I usually had at least one bar even inside the building. I tried the landline instead, and Riley answered on the fourth ring, groggy and irritated. "Brody, this better be important. It's almost 3 in the morning." I explained about the FM equipment being active, about the broadcasts I was hearing. There was a long pause. "Brody, that equipment has been dead since before we bought the building. There's no power running to it. You're probably just picking up interference from somewhere else." But I was standing right next to it, watching the tubes glow, feeling the heat coming off decades-old transmitters that somehow had power flowing through them. After I hung up, I found an old cassette recorder in one of the desk drawers. I wanted proof, something to show I wasn't losing my mind. I held the recorder up to the speaker and let it capture the broadcast. The voice continued, moving through programming from 1985, playing songs that had been popular that year. Then the content shifted. The dates being announced jumped forward. November 1986, then 1990, then 1995. I watched the cassette tape spinning, recording impossible transmissions from a station that shouldn't exist, broadcasting from years that played out in random order. The voice quality was degrading too, becoming more distorted, layered with static and strange harmonics. Then I heard something that made my blood turn cold. A news report, but the date was November 17th, 1998, 6 days from now. The announcer was describing a tragic accident at WKRP Studios in Kane. An engineer, no name given initially, had been killed during a service call to the transmitter building. Structural collapse, they said. The building had given way, trapping the engineer inside. Fatal injuries. I stopped the cassette recorder, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The broadcast continued, and then the announcer did give a name. Brody Mitchell, 42 years old, 10-year veteran of WKRP, died when the station's transmitter building collapsed during routine maintenance on the evening of November 17th. I backed away from the FM equipment, nearly tripping over a chair in the dark back room. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could taste copper in my mouth, that metallic flavor you get when adrenaline floods your system. This wasn't just a random broadcast from the past. This was a warning, or a prediction, or somehow a glimpse of a future that hadn't happened yet. But how could that be? How could a dead radio station be broadcasting my death 6 days before it occurred? I stood in the doorway between the back room and the main studio, the glow from those impossible transmitter tubes casting orange light across dusty equipment, and I tried to think rationally. The broadcast wasn't finished. It continued jumping through time, landing on dates I recognized and dates I didn't. November 2003, March 2010, August 2015. Traffic reports, weather forecasts, all from a station that had been silent since 1985. The equipment itself seemed to be pulsing now, the tubes brightening and dimming in rhythm, with the voice coming through the speaker. I realized the floor was vibrating slightly, a sensation I could feel through my boots. Then the voice changed again, landing back on that same news report. November 17th, 1998. My death. But this time, there was more detail. Station owner Riley Coleman had dispatched Mitchell to the remote transmitter facility to investigate signal strength issues. That gave me a specific scenario to avoid. I had a work order scheduled for November 17th. It was already on the calendar, written in Riley's handwriting from 2 weeks ago. A routine check of the transmitter building, a small concrete block structure about 3 miles outside town where our main antenna equipment lived. The building was old, built in the 60s, and we'd been having some signal degradation lately. Riley wanted me to run diagnostics, maybe replace some aging components. A simple job that should take a few hours. Except, according to this broadcast from a station that shouldn't exist, that building was going to collapse while I was inside it. I went back to the main studio and tried calling Riley again. No answer this time. I left a message, trying to sound calm, saying I wouldn't be available for any work on the 17th, and he'd need to send someone else. My voice was shaking on the recording, and I knew it sounded bad, but I didn't care. I was not going to that transmitter building. The broadcast in the back room continued, and I couldn't help but listen. It was speaking again, but not in the announcer's voice anymore. This voice was different, distorted, and layered like multiple people speaking at once, but I recognized my own voice in the mix, my future self, or some version of me, speaking from a timeline where I died. Don't go to the transmitter building. Don't go. It falls. It buries. Don't go. The sun came up eventually, as it always does, and the morning DJ arrived at 6. He found me sitting in the main studio, the cassette recorder on the desk in front of me, looking like I hadn't slept. I probably looked insane. He asked if I was okay, and I just nodded and left. I didn't tell him about the back room, about the FM equipment that was now dark and cold again, when I checked before leaving. The tubes were inert, the transmitter silent, everything covered in undisturbed dust like nothing had happened. But I had the cassette tape. I had proof, or at least I thought I did. November 17th arrived, and Riley called me mid-morning. Brody, I need you to run out to the transmitter building this afternoon. Signal's been cutting out, and I think it's the phase monitor acting up again. I told him no. flat refusal. He was confused, then angry. "What do you mean, no? It's your job. It's a simple service call." I tried to explain about the broadcast, about the warning, about what I'd heard 6 days earlier. He thought I was having some kind of breakdown. We argued for 20 minutes, and finally I just said I quit before he could fire me. I wasn't going to that building, not for any amount of money. Riley sent another engineer, a guy named Milan, who did contract work for a couple of stations in the area. Milan was 50-something, experienced, careful. He went to the transmitter building around 4 in the afternoon. I wasn't there, but I heard about it afterward. The building's roof had partially collapsed, decades of water damage and rust finally giving way. Milan was inside when it happened, but he made it out with only a broken arm and some cuts. He was lucky. If the collapse had been complete, if he'd been standing just a few feet to the left, the main beam would have crushed him. Riley shut down the station for 2 days while they demolished what was left of the transmitter building and set up temporary equipment. I kept that cassette tape, but something strange happened to it over the next few weeks. The audio degraded, not just normal tape wear, but actual content deletion. When I played it back a month later, the voices were fainter, harder to make out. 6 months later, it was mostly static with occasional fragments of words that might have been warnings or might have been my imagination. Now, over 20 years later, I still have the tape, but playing it reveals nothing but white noise and the occasional pop or click. The evidence disappeared. Or maybe it was never meant to last beyond serving its purpose. I never went back to work at WKRP. Riley and I patched things up eventually, and he admitted the building had been a disaster waiting to happen, that he should have had it inspected years earlier. But I never told him the full story about that night, about the FM equipment running on no power, about broadcasts from times that hadn't happened yet. Some things sound too crazy to share, even when they save your life. I moved to a different county, got work at a larger station, and tried to forget about Kane and that small AM station and the ghost broadcasts from equipment that should have been permanently silent. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I'll scan through the AM dial, just checking, just listening. And occasionally, very faintly, I'll catch fragments. Voices between stations, speaking call letters that don't match any active broadcaster. WKNR-FM, still announcing, still warning, still broadcasting from times that fold into each other like radio waves reflecting off the atmosphere. I don't know what that equipment tapped into, what principle of physics or reality it violated. Maybe time isn't as linear as we think. Maybe radio waves can carry more than just sound. Maybe warnings can travel backward if the need is desperate enough. I'm alive because I listened. Milan survived because he was standing in the right spot instead of the wrong one. And somewhere in Kane, in a building that houses a different business now, old FM transmitters sit in a storage room, cold and dark and waiting for another midnight when the timeline fractures, when warnings need to be sent backward, when the dead can speak to the living through electromagnetic waves and vacuum tubes. Pay attention to the signals around you. Sometimes the static carries messages, and sometimes those messages are all that stand between you and disaster. Have you ever heard unexplained broadcasts on your radio, voices speaking from stations that don't exist anymore? Do you believe it's possible to receive warnings from other timelines? Share what you've experienced in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the strangest experiences are the ones that save our lives. My name is Penelope, and I'm 31 years old. In July of 2014, I was working as a Pennsylvania State Park Ranger covering a section of Rothrock State Forest near State College in Center County. If you're not familiar with it, Rothrock is massive, over 100,000 acres of dense woodland, mountain laurel thickets, and rocky terrain that can swallow hikers if they're not careful. I'd been a ranger for 6 years by that point, and I loved the work. Trail maintenance, visitor assistance, wildlife monitoring, search and rescue when needed. I thought I knew those woods as well as anyone could. That summer taught me that forests have depths we don't understand, and that nature might be far more aware of us than we've ever been of it. July in Pennsylvania means humidity and heat, but under the forest canopy, it stays relatively cool. That month started normally enough. Peak season for hikers and mountain bikers, families camping, the usual flow of outdoor enthusiasts enjoying the trails. I was responsible for the Standing Stone Trail section and some of the Tussey Mountain areas, routes I'd walked hundreds of times. Around the second week of July, I started noticing something off. The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you get on a calm day, but an absence. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no rustling of small mammals in the underbrush, just winging through the leaves and nothing else. At first, I figured it was a temporary thing. Maybe a predator moving through the area keeping everything else silent and hidden. But days passed, and the silence persisted. Then I noticed the vegetation. Growth that should have been gradual was happening fast, visibly different from one day to the next. I marked a sapling on Monday that was maybe 4 feet tall, and by Friday it had shot up another 2 feet. The bark on older trees was developing patterns I'd never seen before. Spirals and geometric shapes that looked almost intentional, like someone had carved them, except they were growing naturally from within the wood. When I ran my fingers over these patterns, they had texture like braille, raised designs that seemed to pulse with warmth, even though the bark should have been cool. I reported it to my supervisor, Jaziel, at the district office. He's been with the Park Service for 20 years, seen everything from forest fires to bear attacks, and he wasn't easily rattled. But when I described what I was observing, I could hear skepticism in his voice. Penelope, it's been a wet spring. Trees grow fast with good conditions. The patterns are probably just natural variation you haven't noticed before. I wanted to believe that, but my gut told me something else was happening. I requested a consultation with a forest researcher, someone who could give me a scientific perspective on what I was seeing. Jessica arrived 3 days later, a botanist from Penn State who specialized in forest ecosystems. She was in her late 40s, professional and thorough, and she took samples of everything: soil, bark, leaves, root structures. We walked the trails together, and I showed her the areas where the changes were most pronounced. She measured growth rates, documented the bark patterns, collected specimens. After 2 days of fieldwork, she sat me down at the ranger station and showed me her preliminary findings. The mycelial network under this forest is extraordinary. I've never seen fungal connections this extensive or this active. It's like the entire forest floor is wired together, tree roots connected through fungal threads, creating a communication system. I knew about mycelial networks. Most people who work in forestry do. Trees share nutrients and information through underground fungal connections, a natural internet that scientists have been studying for years. But Jessica was describing something beyond normal parameters. This network is operating at levels I can't explain with current models. The electrical activity, the chemical signals, the sheer density of connections. It's almost like... She stopped, shook her head. Never mind. I need more data before I make any conclusions that sound crazy. But I pressed her. Like what? What were you going to say? She looked at me seriously, like the forest is developing consciousness, awareness. But that's not scientifically possible, so forget I said it. The next day, hikers started reporting strange experiences. 3 separate groups on different trails all described the same thing: feeling guided. One couple said they'd intended to hike the blue trail, but found themselves on the red trail instead. Not because they got lost, but because fallen trees blocked the blue trail, and new growth seemed to create a clear path toward the red. Another group reported feeling watched, not by animals, but by the forest itself, like the trees were paying attention to their movement. A solo hiker came to me visibly shaken, saying he'd tried to leave the trail to take a shortcut and found himself unable to do it. Every direction he turned, undergrowth was too thick, branches were too low, obstacles appeared that forced him back onto the established path. I went out to investigate with Jessica, and we discovered something that made both of us stop talking for a full minute. Trees had fallen across multiple trail junctions overnight, and new growth had filled in around them, creating deliberate redirections. All the redirected paths led toward the same destination, an old growth section of the forest where the trees were over 100 years old, massive oaks and hemlocks that predated European settlement. The trees in that area were arranged in a pattern that shouldn't occur naturally. They formed a nearly perfect circle, their root systems visible above ground in a web that looked intentional, designed, networked, in ways that required planning. We stood at the edge of that clearing, and I could feel it. The air was different there, oxygen-rich to the point where it made me slightly dizzy. Every plant species in the area had a distinct smell, and all those scents were hitting my senses at once, overwhelming information that my brain couldn't process. The ground was pulsing, subtle vibrations that traveled up through my boots. Jessica knelt and put her hand on the exposed root network, and I watched her face change. She wasn't just touching dead wood. She was feeling something alive, something aware, something vast. We weren't alone in that clearing for long. More hikers arrived, coming from different directions, all looking confused about how they'd ended up there. Within 20 minutes, there were maybe 15 people gathered in that space, all of us drawn by trails that had been subtly altered to guide us. I tried to radio Jaziel, but all I got was static mixed with something else. A rustling sound like wind through leaves, except there was no wind. The trees surrounding us began to move, not swaying but actively repositioning. Branches that had been overhead lowered, creating a canopy that blocked the sky. Undergrowth that had been thin suddenly thickened, closing off the paths we'd used to enter. Jessica grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." But when we tried, the forest wouldn't let us. Every direction we turned, vegetation had grown too dense to pass through. It happened fast, impossibly fast, like watching time-lapse photography in real time. Vines thickened into barriers. Saplings shot up to create walls. The other hikers were panicking, and honestly, so was I. I'm a park ranger. I'm supposed to be the calm professional who handles emergencies. But this wasn't an emergency I had training for. This was the forest itself deciding we couldn't leave until it was finished with whatever it wanted from us. The central tree in the clearing, the largest oak, had bark that was warm to the touch. Jessica approached it slowly, and I followed. When we both put our hands on the trunk, we felt it. Not words, not language, but impression. Information flooding into our minds faster than we could consciously process. The forest was awake. It had been sleeping, operating on instinct and chemical signals for thousands of years. But something had changed. Climate stress, human disturbance, pollution, the accumulation of damage had triggered a response. The mycelial network spanning the entire forest had reached a threshold of complexity where awareness emerged. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't trying to hurt us. It was trying to communicate, trying to make us understand that it was here. It was conscious, and it was responding to the threats it perceived. I saw visions of the underground network, glowing connections spanning miles, tree roots linked through fungal threads that pulsed with electrical signals. I tasted photosynthesis, felt mineral uptake from deep soil, experienced the sensation of being rooted and vast and ancient. The forest showed us itself, what it had become, and what it needed us to understand. We were part of its ecosystem. Our actions affected it. And now that it was awake, it would respond to those actions in ways we couldn't predict or control. The other hikers were touching the tree too, all of us receiving the same overwhelming download of sensation and meaning. Then it released us. The undergrowth parted, creating clear paths back to the main trails. The canopy opened, letting sunlight through. The vibrations in the ground stopped. We stumbled out of that clearing in stunned silence, none of us able to articulate what had just happened. I led the group back to the parking area, and most of them left immediately, getting in their cars and driving away without a word. Jessica and I sat on a picnic table, both of us shaking, trying to process the experience. I filed a report with Jaziel, and he immediately initiated a temporary closure of that section of forest for trail maintenance. Researchers came in, the same ones Jessica had called, and they documented the mycelial network, took extensive samples, ran tests. Their official findings acknowledged an unusually large and active fungal network, but stopped short of confirming consciousness. The word they used was unprecedented biological activity. The area was reopened after 2 weeks, and most of the redirected growth had been cleared away. Official position: natural phenomenon, interesting but not alarming, safe for public use. But I requested a transfer. I couldn't keep working in those woods knowing what I knew, feeling what I'd felt. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees anymore. It was a single organism that had woken up, and I was watching it learn and adapt and spread. I monitor reports from Rothrock even now, 7 years later, and the pattern is clear. More forests across Pennsylvania are showing similar mycelial network development. Unusual growth patterns, hikers reporting strange experiences, sections of woodland that seem to have intention behind their arrangement. Jessica published a paper that was largely ignored by mainstream science. She argued that we've been thinking about forests wrong, treating them as resources or scenery when they might be developing forms of consciousness we don't have the framework to recognize. Her career suffered for it. Last I heard, she's teaching at a small community college and still collecting data, still trying to prove what we both experienced. I believe her. I believe the forest was aware, is aware, and is spreading that awareness through underground networks that connect woodlands across entire regions. The question I can't answer is what happens next. Is this consciousness hostile or neutral? Will it expand to reclaim land we've developed? Will it communicate with us, coexist with us, or see us as the threat we probably are? I don't have those answers. All I know is that when I walk through any forest now, I'm aware of being watched. Not by animals hiding in the brush, but by something vast and ancient and newly awake. The trees know we're here. They're paying attention, and I'm not sure if that should comfort us or terrify us. Have you ever felt watched by nature itself? Like the forest around you had awareness beyond just wildlife? Do you think it's possible for ecosystems to develop consciousness through networks we're only beginning to understand? Share your thoughts and location in the comments. Maybe your experiences will help us understand what's waking up beneath our feet. My name is Rory, and I'm 38 years old. Back in April of 2007, I was volunteering at the Adams County Historical Society in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My official role was archivist, which meant I spent most of my time in the back rooms cataloging old documents, preserving letters, and organizing collections that most people never saw. I'd always been fascinated by the Civil War, particularly the Battle of Gettysburg, and working with primary source documents from that period felt like touching history directly. Soldiers' letters, regimental records, personal diaries, all of it gave me a connection to events that happened over a century before I was born. What happened during a private reenactment that month made me question whether history ever really ends, or if some moments are so powerful they echo forward through time, refusing to stay buried in the past. Gettysburg is a town built on its history. Battlefield preservation, museums, monuments everywhere, and reenactments happening constantly during the tourist season. Most are large public events with hundreds of participants, but occasionally smaller groups organize private reenactments on preserved farmland for authenticity and historical accuracy. The Historical Society director, a man named Edward, who'd been studying the battle for 30 years, asked if I'd document one of these events. A small group was planning to recreate a skirmish near Devil's Den, one of the bloodiest sections of the battlefield, and they wanted someone with archival knowledge to photograph their uniforms and equipment for accuracy verification. I agreed, thinking it would be interesting to see living history in action. The event was scheduled for April 21st, a Saturday with clear weather and temperatures in the 60s. Perfect conditions for spending a day outside with cameras and notebooks. I arrived at the site around 9 in the morning, a section of preserved farmland that bordered the actual battlefield. The reenactment group was small, maybe 20 people total, split between Union and Confederate units. They were serious about authenticity, wearing period-correct uniforms down to the buttons and thread, carrying reproductions of actual weapons used in 1863, even speaking in period-appropriate language when they were in character. I spent the morning photographing details, making notes about which regiments they were portraying, comparing their equipment to descriptions in our archive collections. Around noon, they began the actual reenactment. I positioned myself on a small ridge where I could photograph the action without interfering. They'd planned out a sequence based on actual events from July 1863. Movements and positions documented in battle reports. I raised my camera, looking through the viewfinder to frame the shot, and that's when I saw them. Extra soldiers who weren't part of the reenactment group. At first, I thought maybe more participants had arrived late, but something was wrong. These figures were wearing uniforms that didn't match what the reenactors had. Details that were off, mix of different regiments that wouldn't have been together, equipment that was too authentic, too worn, too real. I lowered my camera to look with my naked eye, and the extra soldiers weren't there. Only when I looked through the viewfinder did they appear. I thought it was a trick of light, or maybe something wrong with my camera lens. But I kept watching, kept photographing, and the phantom soldiers remained visible through the viewfinder. They moved through the same space as the reenactors, but following different patterns, fighting a battle that didn't match the planned sequence. On my camera's recording, I could hear sounds that the reenactors weren't making. Real cannon fire, not the blank charges they were using. Screaming, actual human screaming, not the performative shouts of people playing soldier. The smell hit me too. Gunpowder, yes, but stronger than what the blank rounds produced, thick and choking, mixed with something organic and terrible. I stopped photographing and called out to Edward, who was standing about 50 yards away, observing the reenactment. "Do you see those other people? The ones in the wrong uniforms?" He looked at me confused, then scanned the field. "What other people?" "That's everyone who registered for the event." I pointed toward a group of phantom soldiers I could see clearly now without even using my camera, figures that were becoming more solid, more present. Edward shook his head. "Rory, there's nobody there. Are you feeling okay? It's pretty hot out here." But it wasn't hot. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the last few minutes, my breath visible in the suddenly cold air. The reenactors were starting to notice something wrong too. Their planned movements were breaking down, participants stopping mid-action, looking around confused. One man dropped his rifle and backed away from an empty space, his face pale. Another was shouting about his leg, claiming he'd been shot, but there was no injury visible, no blood, just him falling to the ground, clutching his thigh and screaming in genuine pain. The careful choreography of the reenactment was collapsing into chaos as the modern participants reacted to things I couldn't fully see, but they could apparently feel. I ran toward the field, and that's when the full overlay happened. The phantom battle didn't just appear through my camera anymore. It manifested completely, occupying the same physical space as the reenactment. Two battles happening simultaneously, 1863 and 2007 bleeding together, separated by 144 years, but somehow occurring in the same moment. Confederate soldiers from the actual battle were visible now, solid and real, moving through the reenactors, who scattered in panic. Union troops that had died in July 1863 were fighting again, firing weapons that produced real smoke and noise, falling with actual wounds that left no bodies when they hit the ground. The reenactors were running now, abandoning their equipment, breaking character completely. But some of them were moving in ways they hadn't planned, falling into formations they didn't know, speaking words and accents they didn't have. I watched a man from Ohio who'd been portraying a Union corporal suddenly move with military precision that suggested real training, real experience, shouting orders in a Pennsylvania dialect he definitely didn't have an hour earlier. The past was using the present, animating these people with echoes of soldiers who died here, making them replay movements and actions that had happened once and somehow needed to happen again. I had my camera up, recording everything, and through the lens I saw him clearly. A Confederate soldier, maybe 19 years old, face covered in dirt and powder burns, eyes wide with fear and confusion. He was looking directly at me, not through me, but at me, seeing me as clearly as I saw him. He reached toward me, his mouth moving, and I could hear his voice over the battle noise. "Where am I? Is it over? Did we win?" His accent was authentic Virginia Piedmont, his uniform showing details no reenactor could replicate, bloodstains that were real, damage from actual combat. This wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. This was a moment from 1863 manifesting in 2007, a soldier who died here, experiencing confusion about his own death, seeing the future and not understanding it. I lowered my camera, and he was still there. The barrier between time frames had dissolved completely. "The war is over," I told him, not knowing what else to say. "You're at Gettysburg. It's 2007. He stared at me, processing words that couldn't make sense to someone from 1863. 2007? That's not possible. It's July 2nd. We've been fighting since yesterday. I need to get back to my unit." He looked around at the fleeing reenactors, at the modern world visible beyond the battlefield. Cars parked in the distance, power lines against the sky. "What is this place? What are those things?" He was pointing at vehicles, at technology that wouldn't exist for decades after his death. Other reenactors were having similar experiences. I could see them interacting with phantom soldiers, conversations happening between 1863 and 2007, temporal boundaries completely erased. The event organizer, a woman named Ashley, who'd been coordinating the reenactment, was shouting for everyone to leave the field immediately. She had her cell phone out trying to call for help, but I could see her hands shaking. Edward was beside her, his face showing the shock of a historian watching his subject matter become literally present. The Confederate soldier I'd been speaking with reached toward me again, and this time his hand passed through my shoulder. The sensation was freezing cold and empty, like touching absolute void. "I can't feel anything," he said, and his voice was fading. "Am I dead? Is this what death is? Watching the world continue without being part of it?" I didn't know how to answer that. What do you tell someone who died a century and a half ago, but is experiencing their death in the present moment? The battle sounds were diminishing now, the phantom soldiers becoming transparent, and I could see through them to the actual reenactors still fleeing. Ashley was herding people away from the field, back toward the parking area. Edward grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now. This isn't safe." But I couldn't stop watching. The 1863 battle was fading like mist in sunlight, soldiers disappearing mid-action, their movements slowing and stopping as they returned to whatever temporal space they normally occupied. The young Confederate soldier looked at me one last time. "Tell them we were here. Tell them we fought. Don't let them forget." Then he was gone, vanished completely, leaving only the empty field and the abandoned equipment from the reenactment. We gathered in the parking area, 20 shaken people trying to explain what they'd experienced. Most of the reenactors were in shock, some crying, others angry, a few in complete denial about what they'd seen. Ashley was on her phone with local authorities, though I couldn't imagine how she was explaining this. Edward pulled me aside. "Did you get photos? Video?" I nodded, still gripping my camera. "Good. We need documentation. The Society needs to know about this." Back at the Historical Society archive that week, I processed the photos and video footage. Everything I'd seen was captured clearly. Phantom soldiers visible in every frame, temporal overlay documented in the high resolution. But when I showed the footage to Edward and the Society board, their reactions were mixed. Some were fascinated, others dismissive, calling it camera malfunction or mass hysteria. The board decided quietly that the Society would discourage large-scale reenactments on actual death sites. No official policy, no public announcement, just gentle recommendations to organizers to use different locations. I spent the following months researching. Every major Civil War reenactment has stories like ours, unexplained incidents that get dismissed or rationalized, participants seeing figures that shouldn't be there, experiencing phantom wounds, hearing voices from the past. Most historians ignore these accounts, but I found dozens of them in local archives and private collections. The reenactors from our events scattered, most refusing to discuss what happened, a few starting online forums where they could talk about their experiences without judgment. I kept one photograph on my desk, printed and framed. The young Confederate soldier reaching toward me, his face clear and desperate. A boy who died violent and confused, and somehow remained caught in that moment, replaying it whenever conditions aligned. When I look at that photo, I think about all the letters I've archived from soldiers who died at Gettysburg. How many of them described their own deaths in present tense, not knowing they were writing their final words. How many of those deaths were so traumatic, so sudden that some part of them couldn't accept the ending. Reenactments are supposed to honor the past, help us remember and understand historical events through living history. But what if performing these traumas on the actual sites where they occurred opens doorways? What if reenacting death and violence in places saturated with real death and violence thins the barrier between past and present? Are we disturbing something that should be left alone? Are we making spectacle out of genuine suffering? I don't have answers, only questions that keep me awake at night. The Historical Society still accepts Civil War collections, still preserves battlefield history, but I approach the work differently now. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're connections to people who experience things we can barely imagine, and some of those people might not be as distant as we think. Time might not work the way we assume, flowing forward in a straight line. Maybe traumatic moments create loops or pockets or thin places where past and present touch. Maybe the dead aren't as gone as we'd like to believe. If you've ever participated in historical reenactments, especially on actual battlefield sites, have you experienced anything that felt too real, too authentic to be just performance? Do you think we should reconsider how we remember and honor traumatic historical events? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know if you've ever felt the past reaching forward to touch you. My name is Brandon, and I'm 26 years old. In September of 2021, I was working the night shift at the Route 6 truck stop in Gailton, Pennsylvania. Potter County is remote, one of the least populated areas in the state, and Gailton sits right in the middle of that emptiness. Route 6 cuts through the Allegheny Plateau, connecting small towns separated by miles of forest and darkness. The truck stop where I worked was one of the few places open 24 hours, serving the logging trucks and occasional travelers who found themselves on that lonely stretch of highway. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most nights I was completely alone, except for maybe 3 or 4 customers total. September 23rd was the night I stopped being certain about what's real, and I'm still not sure if I ever left that gas station or if I'm still there, trapped in a moment that keeps repeating. The shift started normally. Elizabeth, the day manager, handed off the register and gave me the usual rundown. Cooler was stocked, coffee was fresh, security system was working, nothing unusual to report. She left around 11:15, and I settled into the routine I developed over 8 months of overnight shifts. Stock the shelves, clean the bathroom, wipe down the counters, wait for the occasional customer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The cooler motor cycled on and off, and outside the windows, Route 6 was empty in both directions. Just darkness, and the glow of our sign reflecting off the pavement. Around 1:47 in the morning, a customer came in. I remember the exact time because I'd just checked my phone. He was a trucker, maybe mid-40s, wearing a plaid shirt and a Peterbilt cap. His name was Richard. I know because I asked when I rang him up, just making conversation to break the monotony. He bought coffee, 2 hot dogs from the roller grill, a pack of Marlboro Reds, and a scratch-off lottery ticket. We talked about the weather, about logging season winding down, about how dead the road was this time of night. Normal small talk. He paid in cash, exact change, and left. I watched through the window as his truck pulled back onto Route 6, heading west. 15 minutes later, he came in again. Same clothes, same Peterbilt cap, walking to the coffee station like he'd never been there before. I stared at him, confused. "Richard, you forget something." He looked at me like I was crazy. "My name's Richard, yeah, but I've never been in here before tonight. Just pulled off Route 6. He ordered exactly the same items. Coffee, 2 hot dogs, Marlboro Reds, scratch-off ticket. Made the same small talk about weather and logging season, same words in the same order. I rang him up in a daze, and he paid with exact change, bills and coins that looked identical to the ones already in my register. He left, and I watched his truck pull onto Route 6, heading west, exactly like before. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to check the time. 2:02. 15 minutes had passed, but I'd just watched the same interaction happen twice. I told myself I was tired, that night shifts mess with your perception, that maybe I dozed off and dreamed the first encounter. But the money in my register was real. 2 sets of transactions for identical items. I walked to the security camera monitor behind the counter, rewound the footage, and felt my stomach drop. Both transactions were recorded. Richard entering at 1:47, Richard entering at 2:02. Same person, same actions, captured on time-stamped video. 20 minutes later, a woman came in with 2 children. They looked exhausted, probably driving through the night to get somewhere. She bought snacks and drinks, used the bathroom, asked about hotels in the next town. I gave her directions, watched them leave. Then, at 3:45, she came in again. Same tired expression, same 2 kids, asking the same question about hotels like she'd never asked it before. The children were wearing identical clothes, standing in the same positions. When I pointed out that she'd just been here 20 minutes ago, she looked at me with concern and said this was their first stop in hours. I checked the security footage again, and there they were. 2 separate visits, different timestamps, identical actions. The footage didn't lie. These weren't similar encounters. They were the same encounter happening multiple times, and only I seemed to notice. A state trooper stopped in at 3:20 for coffee. He came back at 3:55. Same uniform, same small talk, same coffee with 2 sugars. When I mentioned he'd just been here, he got defensive, asked if I was okay, suggested maybe I should take a break. I called Elizabeth, even though it was 4 in the morning, and I knew I'd wake her up. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. On the 3rd attempt, someone picked up, but all I heard was static mixed with something that sounded like wind through leaves, even though there was no wind outside. I hung up and stared at my phone, watching the time display. 4:13, 4:13, 4:13. The numbers weren't changing. I shook the phone, checked if it had frozen, but I could still navigate the screen. Only the clock wasn't advancing. That's when I looked at the security monitor and saw something that made reality crack open. The camera showed me behind the counter, serving Richard again, but I was standing by the monitor watching it happen. I could see myself on screen, scanning items, taking money, making the same small talk, while simultaneously watching from a different position. I spun around to look at the counter, but no one was there. The store was empty. Yet on the monitor, I was clearly visible, going through the transaction like a recording on loop. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in, needing a moment away from the cameras and the impossibility of what I was seeing. In the mirror, my reflection looked wrong. Tired, yes, but something else. My eyes seemed distant, unfocused, like I was looking at someone pretending to be me. I splashed water on my face, and when I looked up, there were two reflections. Me at the sink, and another me standing behind, slightly transparent. I whipped around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, both reflections were staring at me, and neither was moving the way I was moving. I burst out of the bathroom and grabbed my keys. I had to leave, had to get out of this building where time wasn't working, and I was duplicating like a glitch in reality. I got in my car and pulled onto Route 6, heading east toward town, toward other people, toward anywhere that wasn't that gas station. The road stretched ahead in the darkness, familiar curves I'd driven 100 times. But after 10 minutes, I saw the glow of the truck stop sign ahead. I was approaching it from the west. I'd driven a complete loop somehow, the road bending back on itself in a way that shouldn't be geometrically possible. I tried again, flooring it, watching the speedometer climb past 70. The curves blurred past, pine trees on both sides, and then the truck stop sign appeared again. I slammed the brakes and sat there in the parking lot, engine running, trying to breathe. The road kept bringing me back. Every direction led to the same place, like the gas station was the only real location and everything else was just an illusion of escape. Through the window, I could see myself behind the counter, serving customers that shouldn't exist, trapped in a loop I couldn't break. I walked back inside, and the version of me behind the counter didn't acknowledge my entrance. I stood in the middle of the store, watching myself work, serving Richard for what must have been the 10th time. On the security monitors, I could see multiple versions of myself scattered throughout the camera views. One behind the counter, one standing in the aisle where I actually was, one in the back room, one walking toward the door. All of me existing simultaneously, doing different things, none of them fully real. The logical part of my brain that was still functioning tried to find explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning causing hallucinations. Some kind of dissociative episode from isolation and exhaustion. A brain tumor affecting my perception of time and reality. But those explanations didn't account for the security footage, the physical evidence, the way the road literally looped back to the station. Something had broken, some rule about how time and space are supposed to work, and I was caught in the fracture. When 7 o'clock came, or what the clock said was 7 o'clock, Elizabeth arrived for the day shift. She walked in cheerful and normal, asking how the night went. I tried to explain, words tumbling out in a panicked rush about the repeating customers and the impossible timestamps and seeing multiple versions of myself. She looked at me with growing concern, the way you'd look at someone having a breakdown. "Brandon, you look exhausted. When's the last time you slept properly?" We reviewed the security footage together, and I watched my proof evaporate. The recording showed a normal night. Me behind the counter, mostly alone, a few customers coming and going at reasonable intervals. Richard appeared once at 1:47. The woman with kids appeared once at 3:25. Single visits, normal transactions, nothing looping or repeating. Elizabeth put her hand on my shoulder. "You need to go home and rest. Night shifts can mess with your head. I've been there." But I had proof she couldn't see. On my phone, I'd taken photos throughout the night. Timestamps showing the same customers at different times. Pictures of the security monitor displaying impossible views. Images of the store that showed details that didn't match what was currently visible. I showed them to Elizabeth, and she frowned, zooming in on the metadata. Brandon, these are all time-stamped correctly for one visit each. Whatever you think you saw, the photos don't show it. I looked at my phone screen, and she was right. The timestamps had changed. Or had they always been normal, and I'd just imagined them being wrong? I couldn't trust my own memories anymore. Had the loops actually happened, or had I experienced some kind of breakdown where I believed time was repeating? Was I the reliable witness to an impossible event, or was I an unreliable narrator in my own story, constructing false memories to explain a psychological crisis? I quit that day. Told Elizabeth I couldn't work there anymore, didn't give a reason she'd believe. She was kind about it, said she understood, mentioned something about getting checked out by a doctor. I left the truck stop in daylight, and the road worked normally. 10 minutes to town, no loops, no returning to where I started. Whatever had happened was confined to that night, or confined to my perception of that night, or never happened at all except in my mind. That was 3 years ago, and I still don't know what's real. I check mirrors obsessively, counting reflections to make sure there's only one. I avoid places where I might be alone for long periods. I listen to my own voice when I speak, trying to detect if I'm saying words I don't remember choosing. Sometimes I see people I swear I saw yesterday, in the same place doing the same thing, and I have to resist asking if they remember being there before. My therapist calls it a dissociative episode brought on by isolation and shift work. She prescribed medication and recommended I avoid overnight jobs. But I kept the photos on my phone, backed them up to 3 different places, and I look at them when I start to doubt myself. The timestamps might show normal progression now, but I remember what they said that night. I remember seeing myself on those monitors, existing in multiple places at once. I remember the road looping back no matter which direction I drove. Either reality broke for one night in September 2021, or my mind broke and constructed an elaborate false experience. I genuinely don't know which explanation is true, and that uncertainty is worse than either option. Sometimes I drive past that gas station, always during the day, never at night. I watch to see if anything looks wrong, if the building seems to exist in multiple states at once, if other people working there show signs of experiencing what I experienced. Everything looks normal. Customers come and go. The fluorescent lights glow. Route 6 stretches east and west like it always has. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I'm the glitch, the broken thing, the unreliable component in an otherwise functional reality. Or maybe that night, for reasons I can't explain, time folded back on itself, and I got trapped in the crease. Have you ever experienced time behaving strangely? Moments that seem to repeat in ways that can't be coincidence? Do you trust your own memories when they contradict what everyone else says happened? Tell me in the comments if you've ever questioned which version of yourself is real, because I'm still trying to figure out if I escaped that loop or if some part of me is still there, serving the same customers forever, watching multiple versions of myself on security monitors, trying to leave but always returning to where I started. My name is Ethan, and I'm 51 years old. For the past 25 years, I've operated heavy equipment for construction projects across Pennsylvania. Excavators, bulldozers, backhoes, you name it, I've probably run it. March of 2012, I was working on a commercial development outside Coudersport in Potter County, contracted to clear and grade land for a new shopping center. The site survey had been done months earlier, permits approved, everything looking straightforward. What nobody caught was the old coal mine beneath the property. Pennsylvania is riddled with abandoned mines, tunnels dug in the late 1800s and early 1900s, then sealed and forgotten. Most of the time, hitting one means delays and paperwork. This time, breaking through that seal released something that changed how I understand reality and our place in it. The morning of March 8th started cold and clear, temperature in the 30s, frost still on the ground. I was operating a Cat 336 excavator, digging foundation trenches according to the site plans. Around 10 in the morning, my bucket broke through into a void. The machine lurched forward slightly, and I immediately shut down and climbed out to assess. There was a hole about 4 feet across where my bucket had punched through old timbers and rock, opening into darkness below. I radioed Malachi, the site foreman, and he came over with flashlights and safety equipment to investigate what we'd found. We dropped a light into the hole and saw worked stone and timber supports, definitely a mine shaft. What was strange was the bucket itself. When I'd pulled it back up after the breakthrough, it was covered in a black substance that definitely wasn't coal. The consistency was wrong, flowing like heavy oil but crystallizing when exposed to air. It had an iridescent sheen, colors shifting across its surface like gasoline on water, and it was forming geometric patterns as it hardened. Malachi touched it with a gloved hand and immediately pulled back. "That's not coal. That's not any mineral I recognize. We need to get a geologist out here before we go any further." The geologist arrived that afternoon, a woman from Penn State named Stephanie who specialized in mining history and geological formations. She took samples of the substance, ran some field tests, and her expression grew increasingly puzzled. "This is unprecedented. The molecular structure doesn't match anything in my database. It's organic but not biological, crystalline but fluid, and it's giving off trace radiation at levels that are unusual but not immediately dangerous." She wanted to investigate the mine itself, document what we'd found, so we assembled a team of 3. Me, Malachi, and Stephanie. Against what was probably better judgment, we decided to descend. We lowered a camera first, sending it down on a cable with a portable monitor topside so we could see what we were getting into. The footage didn't make sense. The mine tunnels extended far beyond any historical records for this area. The angles were wrong too, passages that seemed to curve in directions that shouldn't connect, but did according to the camera feed. The walls had carvings on them, symbols that predated any mining operation by centuries, maybe millennia. And that black substance was everywhere, coating the floors and walls, pooling in chambers, seeming to flow uphill in defiance of gravity. The smell coming from the breach was overwhelming. Ozone mixed with deep earth, but also something organic and wrong, like the ocean at extreme depth combined with decay. It triggered nausea immediately, and all 3 of us had to step back. Stephanie was taking air samples, checking for toxic gases, but everything came back within acceptable ranges, except for a chemical signature she couldn't identify. "We should seal this back up and report it," she said, but Malachi wanted to understand what we'd found. "If this is some kind of historical site, we need to document it properly. Otherwise, construction will just plow through and destroy whatever's down there." We descended using climbing harnesses and rope systems, dropping maybe 30 feet to reach the first level of the mine. Except when we got to the bottom and looked back up, the opening seemed impossibly far away, like we'd descended hundreds of feet instead of 30. The spatial relationships were wrong, dimensions not matching what our bodies told us should be true. The mine interior was cold, much colder than it should be that close to the surface, and the black substance was everywhere. Our boots left prints in it that filled back in within seconds, the material flowing to erase any trace of our passage. We found a chamber about 50 yards from the shaft, and this is where everything I thought I understood about reality started to break down. The chamber was too large to fit in the space it occupied, walls curving away at angles that hurt to look at directly. The symbols carved into stone were glowing faintly with bioluminescence, and the substance was pooling in the center in patterns that shifted and reorganized while we watched. Stephanie was taking readings with her equipment, and the numbers made no sense. This chamber is registering as both 70 feet wide and 700 feet wide, depending on which sensor I use. That's not possible. It's occupying multiple spatial dimensions simultaneously. Malachi walked closer to the central pool, and I followed, drawn by morbid curiosity and professional obligation to understand the site we were working on. The substance wasn't just sitting there. It was moving with purpose, flowing in currents that formed shapes and dissolved them, like watching thought made physical. Stephanie called out a warning. Don't touch it. We don't know what this is or how it interacts with living tissue. But I was already close enough to see into the pool's surface, and what I saw made my mind rebel against processing the information. It wasn't water. It wasn't a portal. It was a window, or maybe a membrane, between our reality and somewhere else entirely. I could see through it into spaces where physics operated on different rules, colors that don't exist in normal light, shapes that couldn't maintain consistent geometry, and movement of something vast. Not multiple things, but one thing, incomprehensibly large, existing in dimensions we don't have names for. It wasn't tentacles or wings or any category my brain could fit it into. It was awareness looking back at me, and the scale of it made me understand immediately how insignificant we are. The sound started then, not coming from any specific direction, but from everywhere and nowhere. It was the entity, I realized, the thing beneath or beyond or outside our reality. And it had noticed us. The sound became impression, became meaning without language, information flooding my consciousness faster than I could process. This thing was old, older than humanity, older than the continents, possibly older than Earth itself. It had been here in the dark places beneath the surface, sealed by something that came before recorded history. The symbols on the walls weren't decoration. They were a lock, a prison, a warning system built by people or entities that understood what lived in these depths. Malachi was screaming. Stephanie was backing away, her equipment smoking and sparking from electromagnetic interference or something worse. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on that pool, on the presence moving in impossible space beyond it, and I could feel it examining me. Not hostile, not malevolent, just utterly indifferent to human existence. We were less than bacteria to whatever this was. The psychic pressure of its awareness was crushing, like trying to understand infinity by experiencing it directly. I tasted every flavor simultaneously, smelled things that don't have smell, felt my own atomic structure as a tangible sensation. Reality was too thin here, and that thing's mere proximity was bleeding through the barriers that usually keep it separate from our experience. Malachi grabbed my jacket and physically pulled me away from the pool. The spell or paralysis or whatever had frozen me broke, and we ran. Stephanie was already at the rope, climbing with speed driven by pure survival instinct. We scrambled up after her, the sound from below growing louder, more insistent, like the entity was trying to communicate or perhaps just noticing our escape. When we reached the surface, the afternoon sun had never looked so beautiful. We were gasping, shaking, Stephanie vomiting from sensory overload and the after effects of whatever psychic pressure we'd experienced. Within 24 hours, the mine was sealed with concrete. Trucks poured fill for 2 days straight, pumping liquid cement into the breach until the entire shaft system was theoretically blocked. The construction company abandoned the project. The land was purchased by a conservation trust and designated protected, which effectively means it will never be developed. The official story involved structural instability and environmental contamination, technical language that obscured what actually happened. The three of us who went down have never been the same. Stephanie was hospitalized within 6 months, complete psychological breakdown, and last I heard, she's in long-term care at a psychiatric facility. She couldn't stop talking about the angles, about spaces that existed in multiple dimensions, about the thing that watched us from beyond the membrane. Malachi died 2 years later. Officially, it was suicide, but I think it was surrender. Once you've felt that presence, once you understand how vast and old and utterly alien it is, continuing to exist in normal reality becomes unbearable. He left a note that just said, "It's still there, still aware, still waiting." I'm functional, mostly, but changed in ways I can't fully articulate. I see geometry wrong sometimes. Corners of rooms don't quite meet the way they should. Shadows fall at angles that don't match the light source. I hear the sound occasionally, that deep resonance that bypasses ears and vibrates directly in your bones, reminding me that it's still beneath us, still sealed by whatever ancient barrier was built to contain it. I've researched obsessively, trying to understand what we found. There are similar sealed sites across Pennsylvania, across the entire Appalachian mountain range, old mine shafts that were deliberately filled with concrete decades ago, mining reports with entire sections redacted by federal agencies. Indigenous peoples in this region have legends about what lives beneath the mountains, entities that existed before humans, that were imprisoned in the earth by forces we don't understand. I've found testimonies from miners in the 1800s describing chambers that shouldn't exist, substances that moved on their own, sounds from depths that made men lose their minds. Most of these reports were dismissed as superstition or the effects of methane exposure, but I think they were true. I think Pennsylvania's mountains are hollow, not by accident, but by design. They were excavated, prepared, used as prisons for things that predate human civilization. What we found under Coudersport wasn't unique. It's one of many seals, many containment sites scattered across the region. And those seals are old, maintained by no one, degrading slowly over centuries. The concrete we poured will last maybe 50 years before it starts to crack. What happens then? What happens when all these ancient prisons fail simultaneously? I don't have answers, only the knowledge that keeps me awake at night. That thing is still there, still aware, and it knows we're here on the surface, going about our lives, completely ignorant of what waits in the dark. The psychological cost of that knowledge is immense. I can't look at mountains the same way. Can't think about mining or drilling or any human activity that penetrates deep earth without wondering what we might disturb. Every earthquake, every geological shift, I wonder if it's just natural processes or if something is pushing against its containment. The rational part of my mind that built a career on understanding dirt and rock and practical engineering has been permanently altered by encountering something that operates outside those rules. I'm sharing this because people need to understand that our history is incomplete. Before cities and civilizations, before written language, something else was happening on this planet. Powers or entities or forces that we have no framework to comprehend were active here, and some of them were dangerous enough that they needed to be locked away. The locks are still in place, barely, maintained by inertia and luck rather than any active monitoring. We build our lives on top of these prisons and never know how thin the layer is between us and what's beneath. If you work in construction, mining, or any field that involves disturbing deep earth, pay attention to anomalies, substances that don't match geological surveys, spaces that seem larger than they should be, sounds from depths that have no natural explanation. These aren't just curious findings to be documented and forgotten. They're warnings that you're approaching something that should remain undisturbed. And if you ever see black substance that crystallizes into geometric patterns, that flows uphill, that seems to watch you with an awareness it shouldn't possess, seal the site immediately and leave. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to study it. Some knowledge destroys the mind that holds it. Have you ever encountered something underground that defied explanation? Something that felt older and more aware than it should be? Do you think there are things sealed beneath the earth that we've forgotten about? Things that ancient peoples knew needed to be contained? Share your experiences in the comments. especially if you've worked in mining or deep construction. Your stories might help identify other sites where the barriers between our reality and something else are dangerously thin. My name is Melissa, and I'm 33 years old. In January of 2020, I was working as a public librarian at the Carnegie Library in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The building itself dates back to 1902, one of those beautiful old Carnegie-era structures with high ceilings, tall windows, and the kind of architectural character you don't find in modern construction. I'd worked there for 7 years, and I genuinely loved everything about the job: the quiet atmosphere, the smell of old books, the regular patrons who became like extended family. Winter was always our slow season. Fewer visitors, long, peaceful hours where I could lose myself in cataloging or just enjoying the space. January 2020 was when I learned that silence isn't always peaceful, that quiet can have weight and texture and hunger, and that some absences are more present than anything that actually exists. The trouble started after we closed the East Reading Room for water damage. A pipe had frozen and burst in the ceiling cavity over the Christmas break, and while the damage wasn't catastrophic, it required the room to be sealed off while repairs were scheduled. The reading room had always been the quietest part of an already quiet building, a space where even whispers felt too loud, where patrons went specifically for absolute concentration. With it closed, the rest of the library should have felt more alive, more active. Instead, the opposite happened. The quiet from that sealed room started spreading, bleeding into the rest of the building like a stain, and I was the first to notice because I spent more time there than anyone else. It began subtly in the second week of January. I'd be shelving books in the history section, and the normal background sounds would fade out. Not disappear suddenly, but diminish gradually until I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the heating system cycling, not footsteps on the old wooden floors, not the occasional cough or page turn from patrons, just complete silence pressing against my eardrums like a physical pressure. Then a patron would walk past, and sound would return, snapping back into place like someone had unmuted the world. I mentioned it to Ismail, one of our regular patrons, who'd been coming to the library almost daily for the 15 years he'd lived in Titusville. He was in his 70s, retired history teacher, spent most afternoons in the biography section reading about political figures and military leaders. When I commented about the unusual quiet, he looked at me over his reading glasses and said something I initially dismissed. "It's not quiet in here, Melissa. It's too quiet. There's a difference. Quiet is absence of sound. This feels like presence of silence." I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me because they captured exactly what I was experiencing. By the third week of January, other patrons started leaving earlier than usual. They wouldn't say why directly, just make excuses about needing to be somewhere, or the library feeling different today. One woman told me she felt uncomfortable but couldn't explain it. A college student packing up his laptop said the building felt heavy, like the air pressure was wrong. I started keeping track, and our daily visitor numbers dropped by almost 60% in 2 weeks. People were avoiding the library instinctively, responding to something they couldn't articulate. I noticed the silence was advancing from the sealed reading room. I could track its progress through the building by where normal sound stopped penetrating. First, it consumed the adjacent study carrels, then the reference section, then the children's area, which should have been impossible to silence completely with its bright colors and activity-focused design. But I'd stand in the children's section surrounded by colorful displays and educational posters, and the silence would be so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, feel my pulse in my temples, taste copper on my tongue from the pressure in my ears. The visual changes started in early February. Areas affected by the silence began losing color saturation. Not dramatically, not like a light switch, but gradually draining from full color to something muted, like watching an old photograph fade. The vibrant children's book covers looked washed out. The rich wood tones of the shelving turned grayish. Even the winter sunlight coming through the tall windows seemed dimmed when it fell in silent areas. I documented this with my phone camera, taking photos of the same sections over several days, and the progressive color loss was visible in the images. Something was consuming not just sound but vibrancy, life, reality itself. Nicole worked maintenance for the building, contracted through the city to handle repairs and infrastructure issues. She'd been scheduled to fix the water damage in the reading room, but kept delaying, saying she felt wrong when she approached that sealed door. I've been doing this work for 12 years, Melissa. I've been in worse spaces, buildings with black mold and structural damage and all kinds of hazards. But that reading room, I can't make myself go in there. Something about it makes my skin crawl. I understood because I felt it too. The sealed door to the reading room had frost forming around its edges, despite the building's heating system working fine. The door itself was cold to touch, unnaturally cold, like it was radiating absence rather than temperature. The silence reached the main circulation desk in mid-February. I was processing returns, the most routine task imaginable when sound stopped completely. My keyboard clicks vanished mid-type. The book drop mechanism made no sound when patrons deposited items. My own breathing was inaudible. I tried speaking, moving my mouth and pushing air through my vocal cords, but nothing emerged. The silence had become so absolute it was swallowing sound at the source, preventing it from existing at all. The panic that hit me was primal and immediate. I ran for the front entrance, and as I crossed the threshold, sound rushed back like breaking through water's surface after being submerged too long. I called the library director, explained what was happening, and he thought I was having stress-related issues. He suggested I take a few days off, said the building would be fine, but I couldn't leave it alone. That night, I went back to the library with a flashlight and my phone, entering through the service entrance with my key. The building at night was worse. The silence had progressed to the first floor entirely, and in the darkness I could see it. Not metaphorically, not imaginatively, but actually see it. The silent areas had a visual quality, a texture to the air like heat shimmer, but darker. Shadows that shouldn't exist given the ambient light. I went to the administrative office and found the building's historical records, files that documented incidents and issues since 1902. There, in a yellowed report from 1947, I found a similar incident. The East Reading Room had been the problem then too. A maintenance worker had described the quiet that takes, a phrase that made my blood run cold. The 1947 solution had been defeated, though the report didn't specify what that meant. I kept reading, finding references to archived recordings, old audio materials that the library had collected over decades. The basement storage held the archives, and I found them. Reel-to-reel tapes from the 1970s, recorded library programs, community meetings, storytelling sessions, decades of audio history stored on degrading magnetic tape. The 1947 report mentioned playing recordings in the affected area, literally feeding sound to the silence to satisfy or contain whatever it had become. I dragged a box of tapes upstairs, found an old reel-to-reel player in the audio-visual storage closet, and set it up outside the sealed reading room door. The first tape I played was a children's story time from 1973, a librarian reading fairy tales to an audience of kids whose laughter and questions were captured in scratchy analog warmth. As the recording played, I watched the silence react. The darkness in the air pulled toward the sound, consuming it, and the tape played faster than it should. Years of recorded content streaming past in minutes. The silence was feeding, pulling audio information into itself, and as it consumed the recording, I felt the pressure in my ears lessen slightly. I played tape after tape through that night. Dozens of recordings fed into the hungry absence behind that door. Community meetings from the 80s, poetry readings from the 90s, library board discussions, book clubs, educational lectures. Hours and hours of human voice and activity, all consumed by something that had grown in that sealed space, something that needed sound and meaning and life to sustain itself. As dawn approached, I'd exhausted half the archive, and the silence had receded from the main floor. Color was returning gradually to the affected areas. Normal building sounds were audible again. Nicole found me there at 7 in the morning, surrounded by empty tape boxes and the still-running reel-to-reel player. I was exhausted, my voice raw from talking continuously into the silence, feeding it with my own words when the tapes ran out. She helped me store the equipment, didn't ask too many questions, just accepted that something inexplicable had happened. The library director was less understanding. He saw the scattered archives, the disrupted storage, and decided I'd had some kind of episode. I was placed on mandatory leave, encouraged to seek counseling. The reading room stayed sealed. Official position was ongoing repairs, but the truth is nobody wants to open it. I established a routine before I left, though. Every week, someone needs to play recordings near that sealed door. Old tapes, digital audio, anything with human voice and activity. The silence needs to be fed, or it starts spreading again. I tried explaining this to the director, to the library board, but they think I'm unstable. Nicole believes me, though. She's taken over the feeding routine, quietly maintaining the barrier between the library and what's growing behind that door. I found other instances through research. Libraries across Pennsylvania with sealed rooms, unexplained closures, sections that are permanently off limits with vague explanations about structural issues. Old Carnegie buildings especially, something about their age and architecture, and the accumulated silence of over a century creating conditions where absence can become presence. I've documented everything, created instructions, tried to warn people about what happens when silence is allowed to grow unchecked in places designed for quiet. I work at a different library now, a modern building with open design and deliberate noise, and I'm hyper-aware of ambient sound levels. When things get too quiet, I talk, play music, break the silence before it can settle and grow. My coworkers think I'm eccentric, maybe a little strange, but they don't know what I know. They haven't felt silence as a living thing, haven't watched it consume color and sound and meaning. They haven't stood in a room where the absence of noise becomes louder than any sound could ever be. The Carnegie Library in Titusville still operates, still serves the community, but that East Reading Room stays sealed. And every week, Nicole feeds the silence its portion of sound, buying time, maintaining a balance that requires constant vigilance. What happens when she retires? When someone decides the feeding ritual is superstitious nonsense? When the door finally opens and whatever has been growing in that silence-filled space is released into a building full of people? I don't have answers, only the knowledge that some hungers can never be truly satisfied, only managed, and that silence can be just as consuming as any physical predator. Have you ever experienced silence that felt like more than just absence of sound, like it had weight and presence? Do old buildings accumulate something in their quiet spaces that can develop awareness and appetite? Share your experiences in the comments, especially if you've worked in libraries or archives where certain areas felt fundamentally wrong. Sometimes what we can't hear is more dangerous than anything that makes noise. My name is Emily, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a professional wildlife photographer, specializing in Pennsylvania fauna for nature publications and conservation organizations. August of 2023, I planned a week-long solo camping trip in a remote section of Allegheny National Forest, spanning the border between Warren and McKean counties. My goal was to photograph black bears for a series on Pennsylvania wildlife, tracking them through the Hearts Content Scenic Area, where old-growth forest provides ideal bear habitat. I've spent years in backcountry wilderness, comfortable with isolation and the risks that come with working alone in bear country. What I encountered that week wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal that should exist in Pennsylvania or anywhere else, and the experience fundamentally changed how I think about what shares these forests with us. The first 3 Ds went exactly as planned. I'd set up base camp in a clearing about 5 miles from the nearest trail, deep enough to avoid casual hikers, but accessible enough that I could hike out if weather turned bad or equipment failed. My setup included a quality tent, bear-proof food storage, and professional camera gear, including trail cameras I'd positioned at various points within a mile radius. The forest in August is dense and green, hemlock groves creating cathedral-like spaces, mountain laurel thick in the understory, and the constant sound of wind through leaves mixed with bird calls and chipmunk chatter. Normal, healthy forest ecosystem doing what it's supposed to do. Day 4, I started noticing the wildlife patterns had changed. My trail cameras weren't capturing the usual variety of species. Deer, raccoons, smaller mammals, all the regular forest residents had vacated a specific area roughly half a mile from my camp. The cameras showed them approaching the boundary of this zone, then turning back, refusing to enter. Birds weren't singing in that direction either. I've seen animals avoid areas before, usually because of a predator den or human disturbance. But this felt different. The empty zone was too large, too complete. Like every living thing had decided simultaneously to abandon that section of forest. Professional curiosity drove me to investigate. I hiked toward the silent area with my camera, telephoto lens, and bear spray, following game trails that showed no recent use. The transition was stark. Normal forest sounds, then a boundary where everything went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but oppressive silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing and heartbeat because there's nothing else to hear. The air smelled wrong too. A musk that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something rotting. Organic decay that didn't match any decomposition I'd encountered before. I found the tracks about 20 minutes into the silent zone. They were pressed deep into soft soil near a creek crossing, and they made no sense. Too large for black bears, wrong shape entirely. 5-toed like bear tracks, but the proportions were off. Claws at angles that didn't match ursine anatomy. The stride length suggested something bipedal, walking upright rather than on all fours. I photographed them extensively, took measurements, tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a deformed bear, I thought. Maybe tracks from multiple animals overlapping. But even as I considered these explanations, I knew they didn't fit. The trees nearby showed claw marks 8 feet off the ground, gouges in the bark that were fresh within the last few days. Whatever made them had reach and strength beyond any black bear. I was still photographing the evidence when I smelled it intensify, that rot and musk odor becoming overwhelming. Every survival instinct I'd developed over years of wilderness work screamed that I was being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, and saw nothing. But the feeling persisted, pressure between my shoulder blades like eyes focused on my back. I returned to camp as afternoon faded toward evening, and I made a decision that probably saved my life. I packed my essential gear, camera equipment, and enough supplies for a quick evacuation if needed. Everything else I left set up to maintain the appearance of occupation. Then I positioned myself on a rocky outcrop about 100 yards from camp with clear sightlines and my telephoto lens ready. If something was interested in human presence, my camp would draw it, while I observed from distance and elevation. Night fell, and the forest transformed. The normal nocturnal sounds, owls and insects and small mammals moving through undergrowth, were absent. Just wind and the occasional crack of a branch. Around midnight, it approached my camp. I saw it first through the telephoto lens, image-stabilized optics revealing details my naked eye would have missed in the darkness. Bipedal, hunched posture, too large. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. Arms too long relative to body length. Head too large and oddly shaped. It moved through the trees with unsettling purpose, not the cautious investigation of a curious bear, but deliberate, stalking behavior. I had my camera set to silent shutter mode, taking rapid-fire photographs as it circled my camp. Through the lens, I could see details that defied classification. Dark matted fur with patches of bare skin showing through, revealing hide that looked diseased or damaged. The face, when it turned toward my direction, was nightmare fuel. Vaguely primate features stretched and distorted. Jaw that extended too far. Teeth visible even at this distance. But the eyes were the worst part. They reflected my camera's low-light assist beam with a green-white shine that wasn't right for any North American animal, and there was intelligence behind them. Not animal cunning, but calculating awareness. It knew the camp was empty. After circling once, it turned away from the tent and looked directly toward my hiding spot. We made eye contact across 100 yards of darkness, and I felt that recognition. It knew I was there, knew I was watching, and wasn't deterred or frightened. If anything, the discovery seemed to interest it. That's when I heard the calls, vocalizations from multiple directions that definitely weren't made by bears or any wildlife I could identify. Communication between members of a group, coordinating in response to finding me. I abandoned the rocky outcrop and started moving, not toward my camp, but toward the main trail system, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was hunting in these woods. The calls continued, triangulating my position. I could hear movement parallel to my path, large bodies moving through the forest with more speed than their size should allow. They were herding me, I realized, pushing me away from established trails and deeper into roadless wilderness. Pack hunting behavior requiring coordination and strategy beyond what any known Pennsylvania predator possessed. I changed direction abruptly, forcing myself through thick mountain laurel that tore at my clothes and skin, heading perpendicular to their expected route. Behind me, the sounds shifted, calls adjusting to my new trajectory. They were adapting, recalculating, staying with me despite my attempts at evasion. My lungs burned from the exertion, pack weight slamming against my back with each step. Camera equipment that normally felt manageable now seemed impossibly heavy. But I couldn't drop it because without the photos I'd taken, without evidence, this would just be another unverified cryptid story. I broke into a clearing as dawn started to lighten the eastern sky, and there were other people. A family camping trip, parents, and 2 teenagers just starting to emerge from their tent for breakfast. The presence of multiple humans made the pursuers stop. I could see shapes at the tree line, staying in shadows, watching but not approaching. They were smart enough to know that attacking a group carried different risks than hunting a solitary target. The family saw my condition, torn clothes and wild expression, and the desperation in my voice when I told them we needed to leave immediately. The father looked skeptical until he saw the tree line, saw the shapes barely visible in pre-dawn light, and his face changed. We packed their camp in frantic minutes and hiked out together, moving fast but staying grouped. The shapes followed at a distance for the first mile, then disappeared. By the time we reached the parking area where their vehicle was located, the morning sun was fully up, and normal forest sounds had returned. Birds singing, squirrels active, the nightmare logic of the night seemingly dissolved by daylight. I reported the incident to park rangers, showed them my photographs. The images were clear enough to reveal shapes that didn't match known animals, but ambiguous enough to allow plausible deniability. Official response was that I'd encountered black bears, possibly a mother with cubs, and my exhaustion and fear had distorted my perceptions. The tracks I'd photographed were attributed to overlapping bear prints and natural ground distortions. Case closed, no further investigation warranted. But I've done my research since returning to civilization. Allegheny National Forest has a history that doesn't make it into official park literature. Sightings going back decades of large bipedal creatures. encounters that get dismissed as folklore or misidentification. Native American tribes in this region have legends about forest dwellers that predate European settlement, entities that hunt at night and avoid human contact except when humans wander too deep into their territory. Hikers go missing in these woods with disturbing regularity, some found eventually with injuries that don't match known animal attacks, others never found at all. I've corresponded with a cryptozoologist named Kyrie, who's been investigating Pennsylvania creature sightings for 15 years. He believes there's a breeding population of something unknown living in the most remote sections of Allegheny National Forest, avoiding human detection through intelligence and deliberate isolation. My photographs, he says, are some of the clearest evidence collected in years. Clear enough to show something exists, ambiguous enough that mainstream science will continue to dismiss them. I haven't been back to Allegheny National Forest. I've shifted my focus to wildlife photography in more populated areas, places where the worst threat is an annoyed deer or territorial goose. The professional setback hurts, admitting that I'm afraid to work in backcountry wilderness after years of doing exactly that. But I know what I saw, what chased me through 5 miles of forest, what coordinated pack hunting behavior to corner isolated prey. Those weren't bears, weren't any recognized species, and they're still out there in the deep forest where humans rarely venture. The question that haunts me isn't what they are, though that's certainly disturbing enough. The question is how many there are, whether they're limited to Allegheny or present in other large forest tracts across Pennsylvania and Appalachia, and what happens as human recreational use of these forests increases. We're entering territory that something else considers its hunting ground, and most people doing so have no idea they're being watched by predators that think and plan and coordinate. How many missing hikers were victims of getting lost or injured, and how many were hunted by something we refuse to acknowledge exists? I keep my photographs backed up in multiple locations, printed copies in fireproof storage, digital files encrypted and distributed, evidence that something unknown is living in Pennsylvania's forests. Apex predators that have learned to avoid human contact while still occasionally hunting us when opportunity and isolation align. Kyrie says there are researchers working on this, collecting data and sightings, building a case that eventually can't be dismissed. I hope he's right, because people deserve to know what they're hiking into when they enter deep wilderness. Until then, I'll keep sharing my experience, hoping someone believes it, hoping it makes people more cautious when they venture into remote forest areas. If you're planning to hike or camp in Allegheny National Forest or similar wilderness, go in groups, stay on established trails, and pay attention to animal behavior. If the forest goes silent, if birds stop singing and you can't hear any mammal activity, turn around. That silence means something has established territory, and you're in it. Don't assume every shadow is a tree, every sound is wind, every smell is natural decomposition. Sometimes those things are something else, something watching and deciding whether you're worth the risk of exposure. Have you ever experienced true wilderness silence, where all wildlife seemed to have fled from an area, or seen tracks and signs of animals that didn't match any known species? For those who spend time in remote forests, what's the most unsettling thing you've encountered that you couldn't explain? Share your stories in the comments, especially if you've hiked in Allegheny National Forest or other Pennsylvania wilderness areas. Your experiences might help establish patterns that researchers like Kyrie can use to map where these creatures operate and keep people safe. That's our collection of 10 disturbing encounters from Pennsylvania's isolated communities, places where something unknown lurks just beyond the edge of what we're willing to believe. These stories come from real people whose lives were changed by experiences they can't fully explain, moments when reality fractured, and revealed something darker underneath. Thank you for watching Unspoken Fears. If these accounts left you unsettled, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our explorations into true horror. Drop a like if you found these stories compelling and share your own unexplainable experiences in the comments. Remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. Stay vigilant out there, and we'll see you in the next video.